First up is Kalev Peekna, our head of practice, and please give it up for the best dressed man here.
Usually a low bar to be the best dressed man, but I'll take it. Hi everybody, my name is Kalev, that rhymes with olive if I haven't met you, and I'm the head of practice, which is an unhelpfully ambiguous title that I've recently acquired. It just means I run strategy, design, and technology. I was so excited about this topic. I love this topic. This is the title of my presentation. It's going to be all about resilience. I thought about first calling it this, but then I realized like referencing Dr. Strangelove is an obnoxiously Gen X move, so I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to start our conversation today where all good business theories start, and that's with Muppets. So I don't know if any of you guys have heard this, but Dahlia Lithwick published what she called the Grand Unified Theory of Muppet Types. It came out in 2012. And it's a brilliant theory because the second you read this one sentence, you kind of get it, right? Like everybody is either a chaos Muppet or an order Muppet. And even with that sentence, you kind of get it. But in case you want to see a little bit of explanation, we'll dive in a little bit. On the one hand, there are the chaos Muppets. They're kind of out of control. They like to mess things up. They do tend to show up in the Muppet universe with bright colors and really fuzzy coats. And their kind of job in the world is to keep the world on its toes. It's what they do. The classic Chaos Muppets are like Ernie, Animal, obviously, Cookie Monster, Miss Piggy, Oscar, that sort of guy. And then on the other hand, there are the Order Muppets, right? They're neurotic, they're highly regimented, they have really large eyebrows. Hold on to that, they will become important. I think it's because they can scowl more effectively. Their job, though, is to basically counteract the Chaos Muppets and make sure the world can keep running. And so the classic Order Muppets are Bert, Scooter, Kermit the Frog, Big Bird. Their job is to kind of fight all the chaos and bring order. Now, here's a confession. This is not the first One North talk at which Muppet theory has been discussed. So I'm kind of bringing it back. There was, we did an event about 8 years ago where one of the creative directors, a guy named Michael, got up and introduced this theory. And his take on it was like, hey, we got the Chaos Muppets and they're like the creative cool kids. And then on the other side, we have the Order Muppets. And when he said that, he pointed right to me. And everyone laughed, and it was not at all traumatic, and I don't still think about it 8 years later. And it's mostly not the reason he doesn't work for us anymore. But my real reaction in that moment, like honest to God, was surprise, because I was like, wait a minute, I don't think of myself as an Order Muppet. Am I really the Order Muppet? And, I do a little bit of self-examination, and I could understand why Michael thought I was the Order Muppet. I am the type of person who irons my sheets. It's not my actual bed because that would be creepy. I got that off the internet. But I do like crisply ironed linens. I do it myself. I do like to organize all my accessories by color. This is a shot from my actual closet. That is a full wall full of different accessories, neatly organized on a pegboard system. I like to organize my books by subject. So you guys recognize this is where I put all the Scottish philosophy. We all need a place for our Scottish philosophy books. And in my head, that's where the Scotch also belongs. It works. That works. It makes sense to me. And I've even got the eyebrows. So this portrait is my grandfather, Oscar. He was a doctor. He died when I was 1, so I never actually met him. And he died while still kind of being held under house arrest in the Soviet Union, so I never met him. And we didn't actually get photographs of him until Estonia became free in 1989. By that time, I was a teenager. And so this package comes, and I was eager because this is the only image I had of him. And I, when I was a little kid, was scared of this portrait. And my family thought it was really funny, but he looked so stern, and he had these like giant eyebrows. And then we got the real photo. There's no Photoshop involved. That is an honest-to-God photograph. And I realized genetically, I am a Muppet. That is insane. That is totally nuts. And actually, just a few days ago on Mother's Day, my mom admitted, finally, in a sort of hushed voice, she was like, people did call him like Dr. Eyebrows behind his back. But he was a very sweet guy. He was an ear, nose, throat surgeon. But I guess like it's really my genetic destiny. So the thing about it that makes me not identify as an order Muppet, even though all the signs are there, is that in my heart of hearts, I love chaos. That's why I was so excited for this entire concept and this event. I think it's one of the coolest things, and it is actually, as a concept, something I think about all the time. And I'm just going to show you a few of the things that I just love about chaos. The first is that chaos, and especially chaos theory in mathematics, is incredibly important to all different kinds of parts of our lives, even if you didn't know about it. So the ability to sort of analyze chaos is key to our understanding of financial markets, weather predictions, fluid dynamics, all of this stuff, right? It's also the core of our existence. So when you get down to the physics of the incredibly small quantum mechanics, one of the things that you get taught or realize when you do the math is that all of existence is fundamentally probabilistic. Stay with me for a second, but it means that whether or not a thing exists, even whether or not you exist, is never completely true or untrue. There's just a very high or very low probability that you exist. And as you go down further and further, those probabilities go less towards the ends and more towards the center, and you get into this really weird state where things can both exist and not exist in the same time, or they exist in two places. And the thing that will totally bake your noodle if you study it is that it actually, people love that metaphor, I use it all the time, but it has to be that way in order to get to our reality where you can indeed be reasonably sure that you exist, right? So you actually need it to be chaotic in one level in order to get to the order on another level. This is the point, in case you don't know me and we haven't met, where I should admit that both of my parents were particle physicists. So I know all this because this is what they did instead of parenting. It's fine though. I'm not traumatized by it. No, seriously, like we didn't talk about imaginary things like dragons and unicorns and human emotions. We talked about string theory and quantum superposition. Moving on though, because I feel like I've extended the boundaries of relatability. Chaos is actually what creates life, and this is another cool thing. So evolution has been throwing people in sort of a common sense way because there's something about it that doesn't make sense. It is fundamentally chaotic. It's random. Genetic mutations just show up. How can that lead to all this like ordered, progressive life? And the key here, in case you really want your way out of it, is it's not just one chaotic system. It's the chaotic system of random genetic mutations interacting with the chaotic system of our environment. And it turns out you can take two chaotic systems, make them interact, and if they interact in just the right way, even though they're both chaotic, they will produce order. Side note, it's actually how capitalism works, with chaos on the supply side and chaos on the demand side. It produces a nice orderly market, gets you a good price, the same kind of thing. So, and finally, and this is really important, especially given Bill's crack about the way I was dressed, I really love Gen Z fashion, which is so out there and chaotic. You want to wear a big fuzzy sweater in 100-degree heat? I'm all there for you. You want to wear the tiniest crop top you can find with the most giant parachute pants? That's fantastic. I love it. It really leaves me in the sense of like, how can this be? Like, I don't find chaos to be anxiety-inducing. I love chaos, and yet, if I'm going to be honest, I have spent most of my professional and personal life trying to eradicate it, right? So I was talking to my therapist about this, and I know the second I said therapist, there are two thoughts that you had. Some of you, the ones who know me, are like, well, of course he is a therapist. And the other people who have only known me, interacted with me for about 10 minutes are thinking, but is he any good? Because should we check his credentials? Don't blame Bob. He gave me a really good insight because he knew instantly the crux of this like apparent paradox, which is chaos is not an emotional challenge, right? Any anxiety that people feel when presented with chaos is a secondary effect. It's the effect of not really knowing what or how to think when you get presented with chaos. And that insight actually is really what led me to what I want to talk to you about today for the rest of my time. So diving into it, I did a lot of research. I looked at like chaos and our cognitive responses to it, and I found some interesting things about it. One of these three statements is a lie. So if we, on one point, we can say like chaos reduces information, right? It's disordered. Chaos is unpredictable. It's hard to know where chaos is going in the future. And then chaos breaks the rules, right? Chaos means that there's either no rules or you're watching the rules break and maybe shift to new rules. Anybody want to take a guess as to which one is not true? No, chaos is by definition unpredictable. And this is the counterintuitive thing. I know. No, I did that because the one that is a lie is counterintuitive. And this will become important in terms of like my advice for how to navigate chaos. The really interesting thing about chaos is the rules almost always still apply. It is true that chaos by definition means that you are looking at less information, right? You're looking at something that's got less order. So it's hard to understand. And it is also hard to predict, but there are always rules. And in order to demonstrate that, I want to talk about the three-body problem. Don't worry, no spoilers. It's a hot Netflix show. You should watch it. But this entire sci-fi adventure is based on this simple physics simulation, which I'm just going to show you rather than explain. It's three bodies or planets put into a two-dimensional space, and they're just going to interact with regular old gravity, just the same equation you learned in high school science or whatever. And this is what it looks like. If I can get it to go. There we go. Starts off, pretty, makes sense, right? Okay, they've got their own orbits, but watch, it doesn't take long before things start getting really, really screwy. And this is a famous problem in mathematics and physics, right? And the fact, one of the reasons why it's famous is that it has no solution. And what they mean by that is that if you look at these kind of systems where three bodies orbit, all orbit each other, you can look at this, and if you come across a system like this, there is no way, mathematically, no way to predict where they're going to be past the very near future, right? This is the paradigmatic chaotic system, but there are still rules, like gravity still applies. This is actually all the rules operating the way they should. It's just producing a situation in which it's hard for you to understand what's going on, and it's hard for you to predict the future. And what that means is that resilience to chaos really isn't about emotional well-being or control, right? If it's not an emotional challenge, then responding to it isn't a matter, you don't have to go and self-examine yourself and control your emotions. What you really need to do is figure out a way to think and act when you have incomplete information and an unpredictable future. That's the challenge in a nutshell. So I'm going to break it down into 2 points, right? We're just going to take a look first at what qualities or habits make it easier to respond to chaos. And then we're going to talk about where and how can we develop those qualities. And the ones that I'm going to show you, I'm going to talk about 3 themes. We're going to talk about diversity, improvisation. If you're playing the drinking game, take a shot. No? A little early? Okay, that's fine. And we're going to talk about heuristics. Don't worry, I will define that Greek word for you in a second. And we're going to talk about how those concepts intersect into 3 aspects of our professional lives. We're going to talk about how they interact with your strategies, your team, and even yourself. So, starting first off with diversity. This is my grand motto for diversity. Should let you guys know I am on Tech Systems Executive Inclusion Board. It is a really important concept to me, and the most important part of it, the thing that I'm most passionate about, is that I really want people to stop thinking of it as just a social good and realize that diversity is a business strategy. And I'm going to start showing you one aspect of why I think it works. But before we get into the DEI version of diversity, I actually just want to talk about diversification, or really how diversity impacts your set of strategies. Turns out that the same advice you get from every single financial planner about how to prepare for the future, or like future market shocks, which is diversify your investment portfolio, also applies to your business strategies, right? So the number one thing you can do to make sure that your strategy becomes chaos proof is to simply have more than one. And there's by now literally decades of research proving that companies that have a diversified strategic portfolio, in other words, they're not pushing innovation in one way, or they're not pushing profitability in one way, they're doing it in multiple ways, those are the businesses that are actually most resilient to future change and chaos. The other thing that we're beginning to learn is that not only should you have more than one strategy, you should diversify in having many different types of strategies. So one of my favorite sort of like business school reads is called Your Strategy Needs a Strategy. And I know it sounds awfully meta, but it is pretty well written, and only, it's a pretty quick read, because it has a pretty simple point, which is there are different kinds of strategies in the world, and those strategies are optimized for different kinds of situations according to, can you predict the future, how much of the current situation can you change, and what kind of resources do you have on hand. The people who published this book did some really interesting analysis in terms of, what strategies are people pursuing. And the interesting thing is, over time, especially since the 1980s, they've been tracking the Fortune 500. They've noticed that people have done a pretty good job of diversifying their strategic portfolios. They pursue many different kinds of strategies at the same time. The one thing that I want to observe here, though, and it'll become relevant when we talk about chaos, is everybody in my world, my background is within strategy, gets really distracted by the visionary strategies. And I know why. They're bold. They sound cool, right? They're the ones that state your most ambitious aims. But those are the ones that are least suited to chaotic conditions, right? They require a true visionary strategy requires that you be able to look into the future, right? And if you're truly in a situation where it's hard for you to look into the future, then maybe a visionary strategy is not the right one for you to pick. Let's talk about, what you probably all thought about when I first mentioned diversity, which is the diversity of our teams. This is something which again, there has been years and years of data about it, but I still feel like we don't talk about it enough, which is that diversification of your teams, of your employee set, is a business strategy that will lead you to better financial performance. In this case, we have McKinsey to thank for tracking this information. They've been doing it since 2015. So I'll just show you the endpoints. They do it every couple years, but in 2015, their data showed that companies that are in the first quartile of gender diversity in leadership were about 15% more likely to outperform their peers. And with ethnic diversity or racial diversity, they're about 35% more likely to outperform their peers. The most recent set of information, which came from the end of 2023, meant that gap got even bigger, right? The impact is only growing, and now it's about an equal 39% on both gender diversity and ethnic diversity. Again, what this means is that if you are a company that has high gender diversity, ethnic diversity, you're now about 40% more likely to outperform your peers. There's just a direct relationship between the amount of diversity in your company and how likely you are to be able to win in your market. It turns out it's also, and this is not a coincidence, it also makes your teams a lot more resilient. So this bit of analysis came from a think tank that in 2022 decided to dive into, okay, what's the real impact of DEI programs in the federal government? Because, not surprisingly, it was getting challenged. left, right, and center. People were saying, are these things doing any good? Do they have any place here? And it turns out that their data showed that the DEI programs were really impacting not so much financial performance, it's the government. They don't really care about financial performance. That's no surprise to you. We all just recently filed our taxes. I don't think they care about financial performance. But it does turn out that what it does is make those teams really resilient. And if you make your workforce resilient, then you get your institution or your organization becomes resilient. And that was what they found to be the #1 impact of those DEI programs. Now, when I wanted to talk a little bit about individuals, and this was kind of a weird intersection for me at first because I thought, is there any such thing as a diverse individual? We're all just who we are, right? We all have one background, not an incredible amount of backgrounds. And then I remembered that we have actually talked about this idea of the T-shaped individual. Mr. Scholes and I actually co-wrote an article about this a few years ago. You can go read it. The link is on the slide. But what we mean by this is, you want to find, most optimally, individuals, they've got their area of expertise, but that isn't all that they have. They have additional expertise where they may not be as deep, but they still have a sort of functional awareness. And the key to this type of individual is that it's the overlapping sets of experience and background that allow T-shaped individuals to collaborate really well with each other. Right? So you might have different deep areas of expertise, but if you've broadened yourself a little bit, if you're a developer that knows a little bit about how design works, or a little bit about how strategy works, or if you're a writer that can do the same, or if you're a designer that knows a little bit of code, you can get together into a multifunctional team and collaborate really well with those other people. The one thing that I would add in this presentation is if you can construct an entire team of just those similarly configured individuals, that's how you end up with a really resilient team, because all those areas of overlap are going to allow them to quickly adapt, change, ideate, all of that. If you really think about yourself, though, where it really started letting me when I talked about T-shaped individuals, and I asked myself this question, well, how do you end up being a T-shaped individual? I thought about Horace Mann. I think about Horace Mann often, but when I was doing this talk, my colleagues were like, no one knows who Horace Mann is. So Horace Mann, in case you don't know, is the father. He's called the father of the public education system, meaning he is the guy in the early 1800s who literally convinced the government we can't leave every education up to each individual church or town. We need to make sure that everybody has access to fully free public education. But here's the really interesting thing if you go back and read his arguments of the reasons why he was doing it, because it didn't come out of this democratic sense of fairness. He actually never really says everyone just deserves an education. He reached this conclusion and he argued for it because of the impact of industrialization. And what he was saying over and over in speeches is that he was watching workers get displaced by mechanization, by industrialization, and what he noticed was if they had at least a high school education, a broad liberal education, those individuals were able to find new work or adapt their job to all these changes. But all the people that had really narrow vocational training, those are the ones who were totally left behind. Now, I could go on about this for a while because I'm passionate about it, but luckily, my friend and colleague, Ben Magnuson, is going to actually pick up this idea and talk more about range in an individual and how that leads to resilience. So I'm going to leave that point with him and move on to improvisation. I was going to do a joke here and try to convince you to sort of do an improv game, but I'm really bad at it, so we're going to skip that. And I'm just going to pick up where Ryan left off and actually talk about it with a little bit more business numbers. It turns out the MBA programs of the world and the business professors of the world are talking about improv all the time. Diane Coutu, she's a Harvard professor. You can tell she works at Harvard because she uses French terms without bothering to translate them. Bricoleur just means improviser. She could have just written that, but She probably paid a lot for her education, so she probably wants to show it off, and I can relate to that. Um, she actually did the research. She's not just an op-ed person. She is a legitimate professor, and her research shows, and this is from 2002, that improvisation, the task of improvisation, is core to resilience. And in fact, if you start looking at MBA programs, you will notice that they all have improv classes. And I mean literally the top MBA programs in the world. So Stanford Business School, Chicago Booth, Wharton, and the list goes on and on. You look at a top business school, chances are you're going to find that they have an improv class and they're sending their MBA students through it. Do we expect the MBA students to be funny? No, no one has ever expected an MBA student to be funny. The point is not to turn them into comedians, right? Or to find them a marriage partner. Sorry, Schultz. It turns out, and Ryan did mention this, all those same habits, those rules of improv that lead to a funny skit are also the exact same rules that are behind the idea of psychological safety. And in fact, this is what the business school professors say when people ask, why are you teaching improv? The reason for teaching improv to MBA students is that it empowers people to both experience and know how to foster psychological safety in their teams. So if you guys heard this term, it's pretty hot right now, psychological safety. The real progenitor of it, the woman who wrote the book, literally Amy Edmondson, defines psychological safety this way: it is a shared belief that it is okay to take risks, express ideas and concerns, and admit mistakes without fear of negative consequences. That shared part is important because if you have just an individual belief that you won't experience consequences, we call that narcissism. When it's shared, we call it psychological safety. And it turns out the reason, again, they're not doing it just because it sounds nice. They're doing it because there is a direct correlation between psychological safety and corporate performance. So they've done the research. Here's some of the research. I think the outcome of this research is super fascinating to me. So first off, of course, teams with high psychological safety tend to perform better. Turns out that if you combine high psychological safety with diversity, you get the highest performing teams, and you can start to see how these pillars of resilience are starting to connect into each other. And conversely, though, if you have a highly diverse team and low psychological safety, you get the worst performers, in a nutshell. It also turns out, and this is actually the reason behind their performance, is that psychological safety leads directly to resilience. And that's the key to why those teams perform so well. And they do it by focusing on these three cultural dimensions. The thing that I want you guys to really remember about psychological safety, and this is something that I have felt personally, and I think the One North team has felt personally, is that it starts at the top, right? Like almost all aspects of culture, right? And Amy Edmondson, I highly recommend this book. I normally don't like a lot of business books, but this one is, I think, pretty clear, well-reasoned, backed by data, all that good stuff. She's a talented writer. But the point that she makes, if there's one thing that I want you to walk away with, is that it all depends on the leadership. So the really hard thing, and it's a hard thing that I've had to admit, if that there are pockets in your organization that don't experience psychological safety, it's not their fault, it's yours as a leader. Like, you are the linchpin for establishing psychological safety. It doesn't depend on their behavior, it depends on your behavior. And a lot of it really starts at the very beginning with how you set expectations. I don't have a lot to add because she's literally the expert who wrote the book, but there is one tip or habit that I would add to her framework if she asked me. And I'm sorry, but it comes from Jeff Bezos. I know, he's obnoxious, broken clocks and all that. I mean, he says so much. He was bound to make sense at some point. Right? But it is, I feel like the Amazon people are going to cancel everything I have arriving to my house. But he had this interesting phrase, and I think it's actually kind of genius. He put it in his letter to the shareholders. He calls it the disagree and commit. And it is very different from the agree to disagree. I'm just going to say that I hate that phrase. agree to disagree is incredibly dismissive. It basically says this disagreement doesn't matter to me and I want to move on, right? And if you're talking about something trivial or with someone that you're never going to interact with again, sure, that's great. But if you value that relationship or if the disagreement is non-trivial, then this is a better way out. And it is a little hard, but basically what you have to say is, I disagree with you, but I'm going to go with your idea and commit to it anyway. And I think we do a pretty good job of this. I do this with Bill Nelson all the time because we always disagree. But the key is, to say, I do disagree with you. I'm not going to patronize you and pretend that I have magically started to agree with you. I'm going to be honest. I'm going to say I disagree with you, but we're going to go with your idea and we're going to work as hard as possible to make it work. That is a much better habit for establishing psychological safety than kind of stepping back and saying, this disagreement doesn't matter. It usually does matter. If you ask across, like, can strategies improvise? This is another sort of existential question. Somebody asked me this, like, what if you need to improvise a strategy? And I thought, the first thing is, most of the time when chaos arrives, you don't actually have to change your core goal or vision behind a strategy. You just need to find, like, a different kind of roadmap. But what if that chaos persists? What if you're facing a situation in which a market is truly undergoing a major transformation, you don't know where it's going, and what if your vision no longer applies? What if you're Kodak at the arrival of digital camera? Spoiler alert, they didn't do a good job of responding to it, but, like, what if you're in that kind of situation and your entire goal needs to change? Well, in that case, you really do need a different kind of strategy, and I'm going to go back to that book, Your Strategy Needs a Strategy, because I think that they do the best job of describing what an improvisational strategy looks like, and they call it an adaptive strategy. So if you start off with classical strategy and visionary strategy, they proceed in a sort of linear way, in a classic way. You come up with an idea, you make a plan for how to get to that idea, and then you go do it. Adaptive strategy is cyclical. You can see the obvious analogs to agile, but there are some key differences. The first thing is you don't envision, because again, in a chaotic situation, the problem is that you don't know what the future is going to look like. You actually take a much more modest step. You vary what you're doing by some small amount. You do that many times in many different directions at once. Then you select the ones that are working, and you scale those selections before you try to vary once again. It is actually the core strategy behind some big names that you've probably heard about. The organizations that are famous for pursuing adaptive strategies are Tata, Google, Intuit. We're used to thinking of Google as like a visionary company, but the reality is, if you think about the Google products you use, they're actually pretty adaptive. The improvements are pretty incremental. They run lots of experiments. They put products up, they take them down. And that brings me to a point that I want to make about adaptive strategies that are important, is that they're neither efficient nor visionary. And the key to doing adaptive strategy well is that your organization has to have an appetite for some failure, meaning you have to know that some of those experiments are just not going to go anywhere. And it's also probably not going to show up as a giant, big, visionary statement, right? You're going to pursue lots of smaller ideas. Some of those smaller ideas won't work out. That's the key to being able to have the discipline to do real adaptive strategy. Let's move on and talk about heuristics. Big word. It's actually a very old word. It is Greek because it was introduced by philosophers who thought the Greeks were smart. They hadn't met Steve Bakitis yet, so they didn't know they weren't that smart. Just kidding. I know, right? Just up here making friends. It used to actually be an adjective. It was heuristic reasoning. It really was just a way of describing practical reasoning, as Greeks called it. It's this sort of practical trial and error reasoning. Lately, we use it actually as a noun, and I'm going to use a definition from Daniel Kahneman. He wrote that book, Thinking Fast and Slow, also another really fascinating book. And so when we talk about a heuristic, when we use it as a noun, what we mean is it's just a procedure or rule that is imperfect, but it helps you out. It helps you answer questions or move forward even if the rule is imperfect. Basically, a rule of thumb in a nutshell. Daniel Kahneman actually introduced this idea of like using it as a noun when he was talking about, and this is like the core point of his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, was he introduced system 1 thinking and system 2 thinking. Again, he used a lot of science to arrive at something that the Greeks did talk about 1,000 years ago. They would call this like practical wisdom and pure wisdom, in case you're a recovering philosophy major like me. But one of the really interesting things about the difference between these two cognitive faculties that we all have that are evolutionary driven is that heuristics were basically developed through an evolutionary process to enable us to make fast decisions in chaotic situations. It's the heuristic side of your brain, the rule of thumb side of your brain, that lets you deal with, like, I don't know, you're walking down a path and, oh my gosh, there's a predator. What do I do? And the reason you have that from an evolutionary perspective is there's no time to logic your way out of such a situation, right? You have no time. You have to move fast. That is what heuristics are for. Heuristics are for when you need to move fast and when you're addressing chaos. I'm going to just show you some of my favorite rules of thumb in a professional situation. If laziness can be the cause of the problem, it usually is. You know, I kind of say this to myself pretty often. It helps me not get mad at people when I think they're deliberately undermining something, and usually they're not. They're just being lazy. It's fine. Projects that stay on schedule have a magic way of staying on budget, right? Long-term solutions are just short-term solutions that work, right? Swag is always the answer. This one is there for Jen Frost. Always said with sarcasm, as she puts it, sure, we can get some swag. You'll still have your the same problem you had before. It'll just have a nice fleece now or whatever, you know? And my favorite one, don't date men who are really into jewelry. That's not just expensive, it's annoying. That one's really personal. I can feel that. I feel like you're saying that wasn't one that you also hold dear to your heart. But that brings me to a really important part about heuristics, which is that they really are not studied. Nobody else can actually just give you all the heuristics you need. They are highly contingent, which is a philosophy term for meaning very specific to a person, a time, or a place. None of them are perfect. They never hold, unlike a logical truth, heuristics never hold up in all situations. They're never correct 100% of the time. None of them are universal. None of them will apply to everyone, right? Like I just gave you a bunch. Some of you agreed. Some of you were like, I'm not sure. That's the nature of heuristics, right? They are not universal. And they're learned from practical experience. So it is real-world experience that helps us develop our own rules of thumb. And we use those rules of thumb when trying to address real-world experience. That's their nature. But how do we communicate them to you? In fact, the funny thing about heuristics is the way that I just did, which is I'll just list you some of my rules of thumb, is actually a really poor way of communicating a heuristic rule. It doesn't help people get it. So with logical truths, formal truths, all mathematics, stats, even a lot of business theory shows up like this. We learn those, we get to those by means of research, analysis, and logic. And the way we communicate to you is I present to you an argument, or I try to reason you through why I think this is true. Heuristics are really different, though. They come from practical real-world experience. So it turns out the best way to communicate a heuristic to somebody is to simply tell a story. And if that, by the way, is the reason why MBA programs and a lot of practical areas, a lot of practical professions like law, like medicine, like business, their study is focused a lot on the idea of the case study. What they're actually doing is telling stories to each other in order to communicate those experiences and help you develop your own version of what you're learning from it or what the heuristic is. What do team-based heuristics work like? So I just talked to you about heuristics in terms of an individual. They do exist on the level of the team. Around One North, we call them kind of guiding principles. I do want to say they are not the same things as values, right? Values are like integrity or ethics, right? Or diversity. Those are values. A guiding principle or heuristic that can apply to a team is basically something that could help complete the phrase, when in doubt, do this. What I'm sharing to you on this slide is actually the guiding principles that One North was founded with. When we started One North, we sat down, Jen Frost actually handed me a piece of paper and said, what do you think of this? And I said, I think this is amazing. And we worked together and we came up with these values. It includes things like courage to say yes. When in doubt, have the courage to say yes. Don't say no, say yes. When in doubt, think forward. When in doubt, trust the collaboration. Those are guiding principles. They aren't always very lofty. These are pretty lofty, but a lot of guiding principles are, applied to just a team, and project, even in individual design. And it's worth taking the time to talk together as a team. So the best way to find out what are those guiding principles that can help drive a team is to do something that we all know we should do, but often skip, which is the retro, right? Which is the retrospective looking back at our experience. Here's like a sample retro agenda. You've probably heard that you should be doing this. We don't do it because we're afraid that it will turn into what psychologists politely call co-rumination, and which you probably call something that rhymes with bitch fest, right? But the key to doing it is there's a few simple rules. If you do it the right way, there's no reason it should turn into that. First, have a structured agenda. Don't just, open up an hour and say, let's chat about it, right? But review what you just did, review the metrics, and ask yourself specific questions. What went well? What didn't? What can we do better? There's many different versions of it. Do more of this, do less of this, that sort of thing. As long as you do it in a structured way, chances are you're going to end up at realizations that look a lot like heuristic rules or guiding principles that you can take forward. In fact, turning them into principles is the key to making sure that the impact lasts longer than that one moment. So I know that by this point that I've talked a lot about heuristic rules, but I haven't really given you any that specifically help you address chaos. And I know it's kind of unsatisfying, but the key is it's in the nature of heuristics that I can't just give you yours, right? Nobody can give you a rule that's going to say if you just follow this rule, the simple rule of thumb, you're going to be able to address chaos, because it's in their nature that you have to kind of work out on your own. I felt a little guilty about this, and this used to be the ending point of my presentation. And yes, that means, don't worry, we're close. But then I thought back at one of my earlier examples, and I thought, is there really nothing I could tell people, no one rule I could give them? And I thought about the 3 body problems. We're going to go back to that, but we're going to look at a slightly different version of it. So it's the same 3 body problem video you saw before, except they've added another dot. In addition to the colored dots, they've added a white dot that indicates where the center of mass is for that 3-body system. So just watch it. Starts out simple, starts to go haywire, but just keep your eyes on that white dot. Right, you guys can see by now, it never moves. And so it turns out there is actually kind of, even in this famously paradigmatic, chaotic system, this system that is unpredictable, where there's not a lot of information, you can't tell where those 3 outer dots are going to go at any given moment, there is one piece of solid ground, and it's at the center of mass of the entire system. It will literally never move. So I thought about that, and I thought there must be something that I could give you as the point, like in our professional lives, what's the analog to that? What is the one thing that isn't going to change no matter how chaotic the marketplace is or our business is going to be? Maybe it's a shock like COVID. Maybe it's just a merger and acquisition that you didn't see coming, and suddenly your work life has changed. Maybe you've just arrived maybe you pulled off a professional change, you're in a different career. What is the one thing you could hold on to that is analogous to that center of mass? And I realized that the answer is really just people. Human behavior changes on an evolutionary scale, right? I think we talk about changes in human society as though, we're all behaving differently. But despite all those changes on the graph that Ryan Schulz showed you, the one thing that's constant is us. What we need as humans and the way we tend to behave doesn't change very fast. It changes over eons. And so my advice to you is that if you are really facing a chaotic system, the best starting point, the best solid ground from which where you can stand and then try to figure out a path forward is with the people. I want to bring this back to where I started in the most important part of my talk, which is me and my own existential crises. By now, hopefully, I've convinced you that some of the key tools that you can leverage to deal with chaos includes diversity. It includes the habit and adeptness of improvisation, and it includes being aware of and knowing and developing your own heuristics, your own rules of thumb. And I hope that you realize that what I've really been trying to do this entire time is convince you that when you get chaos handed to you, you don't have to control it. Your first instinct doesn't have to be to eliminate it or impose order. All you really need to do in the face of chaos is figure out what your path forward is going to be. And that, ladies and gentlemen, and Bill, is why I don't think that I am either an order Muppet or a chaos Muppet. I'm one of these guys providing snarky, unhelpful advice from the VIP box. Probably the one with the eyebrows. Thanks, everybody.
That was awesome.
Thank you.
All right, Order Muppets, where are you? Yes?
Come on, you're mostly order Muppets.
Chaos Muppets? Oh,
cool
yeah.
kids,
I can
yeah.
definitely recognize Canal. Yeah, based on last night's drinks, you're definitely Chaos Muppet. All right, thoughts, questions, a lot of thought-provoking stuff there, ideas. Neil's ready to pass the microphone. John, you're not? Are you ready, John? All right. Oh.
Hi, I'm Tanya from Experian. I was sitting here thinking about the point that you only touched on briefly, the disagree and commit.
Yeah.
And at Experian, we love to make acquisitions, and I'm in the healthcare business, so we're the product of about 12 different acquisitions over the last decade. And so our leadership team is all made up of people who came from X company and are
Right.
now trying to embrace what it means to be a collective. And so this disagree and commit thing is something I would love to take back. But I feel like when you mentioned, you're like, it's hard, and then you kind of moved on. I think the hard part of that is the human side of how do you be a person who can endure and commit, fully commit when you're in active disagreement with the direction. So I guess my question to you is, what would you say are the kind of attributes that need to be fostered with the humans of a leadership team that need to learn how to disagree and commit to overcome what's hard about that, right? Like what kind of, I guess just interpersonal things do we foster as a leadership team so we can get on board more with that approach of disagree and commit?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. I'll talk about it. The first is you have to have a certain amount of trust, and that goes into psychological safety, which is the section where I was talking about that. You really do have to trust people's intents, even if there's a part of your brain that is getting cynical about it, right? You have to trust that the disagreement is honest and that they're not up to something else. They're not opposing you for some other reason. They're not doing a power grab. Even if there's some part of your brain that looks like this is a naked power grab, in the moment, you have to have enough discipline to say, we're just going to address this we're going to treat this like an honest disagreement of ideas. The second part, and this is like a little tip that actually is inspired from the most recent time I did this with Bill, we had this disagreement. It wasn't like a fight, but we disagreed honestly, openly, diametrically over what to do in a deck, right? I'm not kidding. He was like, you got to take this out. I was like, that's the heart of the entire talk. You just killed the most important part. You killed the core. But I was the one that let it go, and this is the key point. We talked about it afterwards because I realized that on the other side of this deck, the outcome, it was Bill's ass on the line, not mine. Right? I basically asked myself, where is the accountability for this moment? I really disagree with him. I think he's wrong. I still think you were wrong. And that's the part about being honest and open about it. Is like, I'm not going to pretend that the disagreement didn't exist, but I said, okay, in this moment, literally, whose ass is on the line? Bill's. Okay, then we're going to go with Bill's idea. But then I did also say, because there were other people listening to us have this disagreement, we are all going to work as hard as we can to make this idea successful. So go with it.
Yeah, I'm going to add the 2 points to that. One, it was in front of other people.
Yeah.
I mean, well, virtually in front of other people.
Right.
And when they see that, especially as you all lead groups, lead teams, lead strategies, initiatives, when others that follow you see leaders doing it,
Yeah.
and they see it out in the open, then they realize they can do that as well too, versus the meeting, we disagree, nothing comes to agreement at all, and then afterwards everyone sort of talks amongst themselves. By seeing it play out, and you saw, I think it was mentioned, tension before and other things, when you see leaders play it out and come to an agreement or commitment on it, then that fosters some of that psychological safety for others to be able to have the disagreement and commit to it as well too.
I think, Eugene, you had the mic? Sorry.
Amazing as always, Derek.
Yeah. I was right. Yeah.
That on-off switch is kind of funny.
Do we get it? John, you one job, John.
There you go.
Okay.
So I really enjoyed the talk. I actually used different terminologies. I just wanted to share. I use ballerinas and cowboys. So in a creative world, I lead creative teams, and there are creative tendencies of someone who always wants to break it and making a big splash. Cowboys tendency versus ballerinas who follows rules of perfecting the beauty of amazing design, copy, art toward. And I found that it's really interesting that when you hire or create a team, you have to create a diversity between cowboys and ballerinas. Otherwise, the work always gets into the one side or the other.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate what you just talked about. The other one I wanted to add comments on is disagree and commit is one thing I really love about when I worked at Amazon. The flip side about it is you have to always think about yourself that whether you are right. If you're right a lot and you always try to be, you actually are right about the situation, then you can disagree and commit because you respect that the other person will be right.
Right.
So if you don't have that type of principle about you try to be right a lot, gather as much as information, try to predict and control your emotions, but yet try to make on a very thoughtful decision making, then you can disagree and commit. But if you disagree and commit people who are not right a lot, then actually creates a complete chaos that you can't really do something about it. So I've seen the both side of it. So you have to have a principle to balance it. That's what I can add.
I think that makes sense. You know, I like that thing. You know, the disagreement commit comes when you've already explained, and I didn't make this super explicit, but you've already explained your sides to each other. You've already done the work of like trying to convince each other on rational terms, but it's not going anywhere. It's not where you would like start necessarily, right? Because if you feel strongly about something, you should make a case for it. Go right ahead. The disagreement commit is what to do when that isn't working. Right? And probably isn't going to work, right?
And I think it fosters compromise. What I'm going to say next, I don't want to be taken in a negative way, but you sort of keep score per se. So in my mind, I know Kalev compromised with me last time. Next time we enter the situation, it's in my mind like, all right, he disagreed but committed to me. I probably owe him a disagree and commit back at some point as well too. Right. So it's not like you're keeping score, but in mind, compromise needs to go both ways.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, yeah.
Laura, I think, did you have your hand up?
Yeah.
In terms of the concept of adaptive strategy,
Yeah.
so Google is like the obvious example. And in thinking about it, I can think of a lot of technology use cases for it and a lot of marketing or creative use cases. But does that strategy work in other areas like finance or, I mean,
Yeah. I mean, that book is interesting because they did it. I think a lot of their core examples were like in healthcare,
okay.
which I thought was really fascinating. They talk about it across many different industries. So that book is great. And actually, you can also just read most of it on a website. It's a bunch of BCG partners who put that together.
What was the book?
Yeah. Your strategy needs a strategy. And it's just pointing out, hey, there are different kinds of strategies and they're suited to different situations. So, you can think about these different models. It's very straightforward and practical. They have this they've got lots of cool charts in there. They talk about the strategy palette. Proves to me they're not really designers and they're business consultants. But, the core insight is that, the kind of strategy you need depends on where you are. It makes a lot of sense to me. And the thing that I wanted people to know about adaptive strategies is, they work really well in chaos. They have some downsides. In fact, they all have downsides. One of the downsides of adaptive strategies is that they're inefficient. You're going to generate a lot of ideas that don't go anywhere. And you have to, if you're going to do it, you have to be ready to accept that.
Yeah. Franklin, I think you had your hand up.
I can yell.
Yeah, actually, Franklin's, he's got a voice on, you're good.
Yeah, it's the theater voice from the diaphragm. I can appreciate the representation of the light dot. Encouraging us to have a fixed focus on the human being.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how feedback amongst the human beings and the value of the philosophy of feedback has enabled you to amplify this sense of resilience on your team?
Yeah. There's few things, there are few things more core to a good dynamic on a team than dealing with feedback. And it's also one of the hardest things to hear and deal with as an individual, which is I think why it requires so much attention. We deal a lot with feedback at One North. In fact, one of the little mini speeches I give to any new employee who shows up in strategy, design, or technology, when I eventually get around to remembering they work for me and I take them to lunch, I will tell them, one of the things about it is that everyone's work is up for examination and feedback here. No one is above and beyond feedback. I put up work. We all did it, for example, in preparing for this. I put up work, and I have to hear opinions and suggestions and changes from everyone, right? And that's one rule, and I tell them, get ready for it. If you're a designer, the developer is going to tell you how he thinks it looks, and vice versa. Right? And that can be really hard for people. And that is a sort of cultural rule that we established to make that work. The other thing, though, and I was thinking about this, is sometimes we talk about feedback and we don't mean feedback. We really mean something more like Ryan Scholes was talking in terms of the improvisation. There's a way for feedback to show up not as criticism, but as people collaborating on helping you make it a little bit better. And the key is the kind of habits that Schultz was talking about when he was talking about improvisation, right? The key is getting people to contribute their ideas, but not a framework that starts with, I'm disappointed by this, so do this instead, right? It is a lot of simple framing, but it requires a lot of thick contextual coaching and leading of those conversations to make it work right. Because feedback is hard to hear, and I'm obviously talking more about the work dynamic than individual coaching and career feedback, which is, I think, a little bit more like feedback, right? And that's a different dynamic than kind of what I was talking about.
Chris in the back.
Hey guys, Chris from Disney. Love the talk.
Thank you.
Disagree and commit. Yeah. Also a former Amazonian. Also love the leadership principle of frugality, especially on flights to and from Japan. Worked out really well. But disagree and commit's interesting. I think it kind of goes back to Ryan's talk as well around kind of the yes and concept. And I think that, Disagree. The one issue I have with disagree is that it puts two people against each other.
Yeah.
And that to me is an interesting thing. It's like, something I always say is like, this is a job. We're here to pick up a shovel and move dirt. And I know that doesn't sound fun and sexy and all that stuff, but I'm trying to like take the emotion out of some of the decisions that I think get in the way of logical decision making. Mm-hmm. And, another thing that getting back to kind of like an objective perspective on things is like, can we get ahead of the disagreement and arrive at a compass or a set of principles to help guide our decision making throughout the creative process? So it's like when we reach a point of conflict or disagreement, it's like, can we go back to a set of principles and say like, okay, let's take your opinion out of it, my opinion out of it, because sometimes it's just subjective. Right. No one's really right. Oh. And so it's like, okay, well, like, is there a set of criteria that we can kind of look back on and say like, okay, based on this criteria, this decision makes the most sense. And it might not be that person's thought or my thought, but it's a thought. And that's the one we go with. And then, the other thing too is like nothing is ever done. And I think that sometimes, at least in my experience, when we reach these disagreements, it's like, oh, if I don't get my way, it's the end of the world. It's like, well, no, let's go test something. If it works, great. Fireworks. If not, well, cool, pick up the shovel, move dirt. Simple.
I know. I think you actually mentioned another like rule of thumb to get about it, which is I think Jessica really loves this. She sends that GIF that's like, "Why not both?" a lot. She loves that little girl. ¿Por qué no las dos? Yeah, there are ways to get around it. What I think the key to disagree and commit, what I like it is that it doesn't trivialize or ignore that the disagreement exists, right? And that's the key to it. Is I think it's highly patronizing to pretend that a business or even a small team of people does everything by consensus. That's not real, right? And we're all adults, and there's always some part of us that knows that's not real. So don't pretend. Just find your way forward. So that's a really, I gave you one way forward, which is lean towards the person whose ass is on the line. You know what I mean? Like if you have a disagreement, whoever is going to be held accountable for this decision, let's lean towards them, right? And often in design, it would be like, it's Jessica and the design team, right? So when in doubt, lean towards them, because if the design doesn't succeed, they're the ones who will be held accountable for that. But you just mentioned another way out, which is maybe you don't have to choose in all situations. Maybe you can just try both and see what works. That's another great way past those moments. That's something that, people can commit to, right? As long as they give up the idea that they have to win.
Jory, last question before we break for lunch.
I think this is more of a yes and.
Okay.
Ryan.
Nice.
Thanks. Something that kind of made me think about that wasn't included, but I think is really critical to resiliency is the unification of people in teams. And that doesn't necessarily mean agreeance amongst everyone, but we can all remember growing up and disagreeing with our parents or fighting with our brother or didn't want to do something as a family, but we all knew we all had to be in it. We were all in the car and we were all going to go on the family vacation, whether we liked it or not. And so
you had a much more normal childhood.
I had yes. But I was the chaotic one. So I knew that I could just bite my tongue and then I could just be a pain in the ass separately and it was fine. But I think what I've learned within my team currently and my teams over the course of my career has been unifying everyone behind a vision will create the resiliency that you need in moments of chaos, because ultimately what you don't want to have is a weak link that is left behind or doesn't feel like they're also a part of the family dynamic.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really critical, because oftentimes when it comes to those moments of chaos, you're trying to solve something very quickly and you just go with, one person or two people, and then others are very hidden and they don't feel like they're a part. And you don't want those cracks in the foundation when resiliency is extremely important in those moments.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think the closest thing that I got to that, I think what you just said is a better, more thoughtful way of something that I only touched on lightly, which is that a lot of times you don't have to change your vision and strategy in the face of chaos. You can stick with that. You just might have to tweak the way you're going to get there, right? That actually, I think, was the number one lesson of COVID, to tell you the truth, from a strategy perspective, which is my background, which is most people didn't have to fundamentally change what they thought their business was doing. They just had to figure out a different way of doing it, right? And that's different and actually much easier to approach than be like, oh my gosh, do I need to rethink everything? You know, we used to be a technology company. Should we sell oranges now? You know, like it's not, you didn't. But I watched clients and other people like have those kinds of existential crises. It wasn't really necessary. Like you can still do what you're doing. And that kind of unity of vision is, I think, what you were getting at.
Yeah, it's the reminder of it too, because a lot
Yeah.
of times you don't have to change it, but sometimes people lose sight of that. Remember, we're all in this. It's like the, you know, renewal of vows every year. Like we're all still here, right, for the same purpose. Like, you know, and I think that really is important, particularly in the diversity of our workforces.
It's cool.
Awesome.
Nice.
All right. Thank you, Kalev.
Thank you.